Right now, in hangars and on flight lines from Wichita to Vero Beach, there are pilots who bought brand new airplanes in 2022 and are trying very quietly to get out of them. Not because the airplane broke, not because they lost their certificate, not because some catastrophic financial event wiped out their net worth overnight. They're selling because the thing they thought they were buying in 2022 turned out to be a fundamentally different asset than what they're actually holding in 2024 and 2025, and the gap between those two versions of the same airplane is costing them real money every single month they keep it. 3,000 new aircraft sold in 2022. That's not a rumor, that's a number the industry tracked, celebrated, pointed to as proof that general aviation was roaring back after years of contraction. And a meaningful portion of those buyers are now quietly listing their airplanes, accepting losses that would have seemed impossible when they signed the purchase agreement, and trying to explain to their family why the dream airplane they were so excited about 2 years ago is now parked with a for sale sign on it. That's the story I want to walk through today, because it's not one simple story. It's a dozen overlapping stories that all converged at the same moment and hit the same group of buyers at the same time. And understanding all of those threads together tells you something genuinely important about where this market is, where it's headed, and what any of us who are serious about buying, selling, or holding an airplane right now actually need to know before we make a decision we're going to be living with for years. Before we get into all of it, hit subscribe right now, because I cover the financial and market side of general aviation in a way that most aviation content simply doesn't touch, and what I'm going to walk you through today is the kind of analysis that will directly affect your decisions, whether you bought in 2022, whether you're thinking about buying now, or whether you're just trying to understand what's actually happening underneath all the sunshine and tailwinds coverage you see everywhere else. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, because this is the beginning of a much longer conversation. Let's start at the beginning, because 2022 was genuinely an extraordinary year in general aviation, and you have to understand why it felt so good before you can understand why it turned on so many people so fast. The pandemic did something to general aviation that almost nobody predicted it would do. Instead of cratering demand the way almost every other luxury spending category collapsed in early 2020, flying experienced something closer to a renaissance. The logic of it, in retrospect, makes a certain kind of sense. Commercial aviation became miserable in ways that went well beyond the ordinary misery of airports and middle seats and delayed flights. It became genuinely anxiety-inducing for a lot of people, in a way that wasn't purely rational, but wasn't purely irrational either. Crowded terminals, recirculated air, masks, uncertainty about whether you'd be able to get home if something changed. All of that stacked up on top of the existing reasons why people with money and flexibility had always found private aviation appealing, and pushed a lot of them over the line from interesting idea to I'm actually doing this. People who had been casually thinking about their pilot certificate for years suddenly had time to get it. People who had their certificate but hadn't been flying much suddenly started flying a lot, and people who were already active pilots decided that now, of all times, was the moment to stop renting and stop waiting and actually buy the airplane they'd been putting off buying for a decade. That demand spike hit a supply chain that was already stressed in every direction at once. Manufacturing had slowed during the early pandemic uncertainty. Parts suppliers were backed up. Skilled labor in aviation manufacturing was harder to find and harder to keep than it had been before. The result was wait lists stretching out in ways that hadn't been seen in modern general aviation history. You couldn't just walk into a dealer and buy a new Cessna or Piper or Cirrus off the lot, the way you could have in 2018 or 2019. You put your name on a list, you put down a deposit, and you waited. Sometimes you waited 6 months, sometimes 12. For some of the hotter models and configurations, wait times stretched out to 18, 20, even 24 months before your airplane would actually be built and delivered. And here's where human psychology enters the story in a very particular way, because those wait lists did something to buyer behavior that had lasting consequences. When you know you're getting something eventually, when you've already paid your deposit and you're on the list and it's just a matter of time, you stop doing the rigorous financial analysis you might otherwise do. You stop recalculating the monthly payment every few months as interest rates shift. You stop refreshing the used market listings looking for a better deal. You're committed. Psychologically, emotionally, financially, you're in. And so when the airplane finally showed up, sometimes a year or more after you initially signed the paperwork, buyers were primed to complete the transaction, regardless of what had changed in the world since that original decision. A lot had changed. A staggering amount had changed, actually, in ways that anyone analyzing the situation coldly would have flagged as serious concerns. But buyers who'd been waiting 18 months for their airplane weren't analyzing the situation coldly. They were excited. They were ready. They were not in the mental state to reconsider. That's the setup. Now let's talk about exactly what changed and why it matters so much. Interest rates are the most obvious and most significant piece of this, and they deserve more than a passing mention, because the numbers are genuinely dramatic when you look at them in the context of aircraft financing specifically. When a lot of these buyers originally made their decisions and put down their deposits in 2020 and 2021, the interest rate environment was historically accommodating. We're talking about aircraft loan rates that were, depending on the lender and the borrower's profile, sitting in the low to mid-single digits. For a buyer looking at a new airplane priced anywhere from $300,000 to $700,000 or $800,000, the monthly payment at those rates was one number. Not a small number, not a trivial number, but a number that a lot of qualified buyers looked at and said, yes, I can make this work. This fits my financial picture. By the time their airplane actually arrived and they were sitting across from the financing paperwork in 2022 and into early 2023, rates had moved in a way that doesn't have a lot of precedent in the modern general aviation era. The Federal Reserve moved faster and more aggressively than almost any forecaster had projected, and aircraft loan rates followed. We're talking about a shift from the low to mid-single digits into territory that, for many borrowers and many loan structures, meant their effective rate had roughly doubled. On an aircraft purchase in the mid to upper six figures, doubling the interest rate is not a rounding error. It's a fundamentally different monthly payment. It changes the calculation from, this fits my financial picture, to, this requires a significant rethinking of my financial picture. And for some buyers, it crossed the line from uncomfortable to genuinely untenable. But here's the thing about the buyers who completed those purchases anyway, and most of them did complete the purchase, because the deposit was already in, the airplane was sitting there, the excitement was real, and walking away had its own psychological and financial costs. Those buyers locked into an asset at a price point that made sense in one rate environment, financed at terms that reflected a completely different rate environment, and they did it right at the peak of what turned out to be a very specific and very temporary demand spike. They bought at the top, financed at the worst possible moment, and they're now holding an asset whose market value is being pushed down by several forces simultaneously, including the very interest rates that made their own financing so expensive in the first place. Let's talk about what happened to new aircraft prices during this period, because that's a crucial part of the story that gets glossed over in a lot of the coverage I've seen. New aircraft prices had already been climbing steadily for years before the pandemic, for structural reasons that are real and worth understanding. The cost of certifying an aircraft with the FAA is genuinely enormous and has gotten more expensive over time. Product liability exposure for general aviation manufacturers, even with the General Aviation Revitalization Act providing some protection, is still a meaningful cost that gets baked into every airplane off the line. Materials costs, particularly for the aluminum and composites that modern GA aircraft are built from, had been trending up, and skilled labor in aviation manufacturing is expensive and increasingly hard to retain in a competitive labor market. All of those structural factors were already pushing prices up at a rate that outpaced general inflation before 2020. Then the demand spike hit, and manufacturers and dealers discovered something that manufacturers and dealers in every other industry discover when demand dramatically outstrips supply. Buyers will pay more when there isn't enough supply to go around. So prices on new aircraft during the 2020 through 2022 period went up not just because of structural cost pressures, but because the market would bear it. Wait lists meant price discipline. When you're waiting 18 months and you finally get the call that your airplane is ready, you're not in a strong negotiating position. You pay what's on the sheet, or you lose your slot and go back to the bottom of the list. And nobody wanted to go back to the bottom of the list. So buyers in 2022 were buying new airplanes that were, in many cases, priced meaningfully above where those same airplanes would have been priced in a normal supply-demand environment. They were paying pandemic premium prices, financed at dramatically rising interest rates, for assets that were about to see the demand conditions that justified those prices evaporate very quickly. The demand evaporation is the third leg of this, and it happened for reasons that are worth unpacking carefully, because they're not all obvious. The most straightforward reason is simply that the wave of new buyers who came into aviation during the pandemic was always going to be a wave, not a permanent baseline expansion of the market. Learning to fly because you suddenly had time during lockdowns is different from being a career aviation enthusiast who's been building toward airplane ownership for 15 years. Some of those pandemic-era new pilots turned out to be genuinely committed, found the flying life was everything they'd hoped, and stuck with it. A meaningful portion discovered that the reality of GA ownership, the maintenance, the scheduling around weather, the currency requirements, the insurance costs, the hangar fees, the unexpected expenses that seemed to arrive at the worst possible times, was more than they'd bargained for when it sounded like a romantic solution to their commercial aviation anxiety. Flight schools felt this too. The massive enrollment surge of 2020 and 2021 had a completion and retention story that looked a lot less impressive a couple years later when you tracked where those students actually ended up. Attrition in pilot training has always been significant, but the attrition from that particular cohort, the pandemic-motivated new starts who came in without necessarily the deep aviation identity that tends to sustain people through the hard parts of training, ran higher than the industry's optimistic projections assumed it would. Beyond the new entrant story, there's a demographic reality that the industry had been aware of, but perhaps not fully reckoning with heading into this period. The core demographic of general aviation ownership, which has always skewed older, wealthier, and male, is aging. Not slowly, but meaningfully. The pilots who bought their first serious airplane in their 40s in the late 90s and early 2000s are now in their 60s and 70s. Some of them are still flying and will keep flying for years. A growing number are finding that the combination of medical certificate requirements, the increasing vigilance of aviation medical examiners around age-related conditions, and their own honest assessment of where their reaction times and decision-making under pressure have gone, means that airplane ownership is something they're stepping back from rather than continuing to step up into. That exit flow from the active ownership pool has accelerated over the last several years and is not slowing down. The insurance industry noticed all of this before a lot of pilots wanted to admit it. Aviation insurance underwriting had been getting harder across general aviation for several years before the pandemic, driven by a combination of factors that included rising repair costs, parts scarcity, and actuarial patterns around certain aircraft types, and pilot experience levels that underwriters found genuinely worrying. The post-pandemic demand surge briefly masked how tight the insurance market was getting, because everyone was excited about buying airplanes and nobody wanted to lead with the insurance conversation. But as 2022 turned into 2023 and 2023 turned into 2024, the insurance reality started landing on buyers and owners in ways they couldn't ignore. Premiums went up significantly, coverage terms got tighter, requirements around minimum hours, recurrent training, and instrument currency got more stringent on a lot of policies. And for some buyers, particularly those stepping into higher performance or more complex aircraft than their experience level had traditionally supported, getting insured at a cost that made ownership financially reasonable became a genuinely serious obstacle rather than a paperwork formality. Let's talk about what all of this actually looks like for someone who bought a new airplane in 2022 and is trying to sell it now. Because the financial picture is stark, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Take a buyer who purchased a well-equipped new piston single in early to mid-2022 at, let's say, $450,000. That was a real price for a real airplane in that period, probably a four-seater with a full glass panel, a capable autopilot, good avionics, the kind of airplane a pilot steps into after years of renting and decides, this is the one. They put down a meaningful deposit, waited their time in the delivery queue, took delivery around mid-2022, and financed a substantial portion of the purchase, at rates that had moved up from where they'd been when they first started thinking about this purchase, but that they decided they could make work because they were so close. What is that airplane worth now if they try to sell it? This is the number people don't want to say out loud, but it needs to be said. A 2-year-old low-time example of that airplane in the current market is worth something materially less than what was paid for it new, and the spread has widened faster than anyone who bought new in 2022 wanted to believe it would. We're not talking about the normal, modest depreciation curve that used to characterize well-maintained general aviation aircraft, where a plane might lose a relatively modest percentage of its value per year if kept up properly and flown to reasonable hours. We're talking about a genuine value decline that, for some buyers in some categories, has exceeded 20 to 25% from purchase price in less than 3 years. Why? Several compounding factors all hitting simultaneously. New aircraft prices, having been elevated by the demand spike and by whatever leverage manufacturers and dealers had when backlogs were long, are now coming back down as inventory sits on ramps and dealers get more motivated to move metal. When new prices decline or hold, while used volumes increase, used aircraft values adjust to maintain a rational spread from new, and that means used values come down too. The buyer looking at a 2-year-old airplane versus a comparably equipped new one wants a meaningful discount for taking the used example, not a token reduction. As new prices soften, and as more used inventory from the 2022 buying wave comes to market, the math on that spread gets increasingly uncomfortable for sellers, who need to recover anywhere close to what they paid. Layered on top of that is the financing rate reality for the buyer of your used airplane. The person shopping for a used aircraft right now is financing at current rates too, which means what they can afford to pay, regardless of what the seller needs to recover, is constrained by rates that are much higher than the environment in which the original purchase was made. A buyer who might have been able to stretch to $370,000 at the old rates finds that at current rates, their comfortable payment ceiling maps to a meaningfully lower purchase price, and every dollar that the rate environment constrains their offer is a dollar that comes out of the seller's recovery. And then there's the carrying cost problem, which is the quiet killer in this particular situation, and the one that I think a lot of pilots who are not running disciplined numbers on their airplane ownership don't fully confront until they have no choice. Owning an airplane that you're either not flying much or that you've decided you want to sell is still expensive every single month while it sits. Hangar costs have gone up significantly in most markets over the last few years, driven by the same demand dynamics that affected everything else, and in a lot of popular flying areas, you're looking at several hundred to over $1,000 per month just for covered storage. Insurance doesn't stop because you've listed the airplane for sale. If you're still making loan payments on an aircraft you want to sell, those continue until the day of closing. Annual inspections don't care about your sales timeline, and any squawks that develop while the airplane sits need to be addressed to keep it airworthy and attractive to a buyer, which means unexpected maintenance costs can land right in the middle of a sales process. The cumulative carrying cost for an airplane that takes 8, 10, 12 months to sell can add tens of thousands of dollars to the effective loss on a transaction that was already going to show a loss on paper based purely on purchase price versus exit price. Some of these sellers are doing that math and arriving at numbers that are genuinely painful to look at, losses of $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 or more when you stack up the price decline, the carrying costs, the transaction costs, and the opportunity cost of the capital that's been tied up in an asset that underperformed. That's the real picture for a segment of the 2022 buyers, and it's part of why the for sale signs are multiplying quietly while the public conversation about general aviation remains relentlessly cheerful. I want to be careful not to overstate this, because not everyone who bought in 2022 is in this position. There are buyers who bought in 2022 with long time horizons, strong financial positions, low or no financing, and mission-appropriate aircraft choices who are flying happily and not particularly worried about short-term value fluctuations. General aviation ownership has always been a long-term proposition for the buyers who come out well on the financial side of it, and people who understood that going in and chose accordingly are in a fundamentally different situation than the buyers who stretched financially, bought at emotional peaks, or purchased an aircraft that turned out to be more airplane than their actual flying mission justified. But there are enough of the stretched buyers, the emotionally timed buyers, the overcapitalized for the mission buyers from 2022 that the effects are showing up in market data in ways that are visible if you're looking at the right numbers. Used aircraft inventory has increased meaningfully. Days on market for used listings has extended. Asking prices versus transaction prices have shown a widening gap as sellers reluctantly negotiate from where they wish the market was to where it actually is. And certain categories of aircraft that were hot in 2022 are cooling noticeably in 2024 and 2025. Let me walk through some of the specific aircraft categories where this story is playing out most acutely, because the details differ in ways that matter if you're trying to understand your own situation or evaluate an opportunity. The single-engine piston market at the higher end of the price range is probably where the story is most concentrated, simply because that's where the 2022 buying wave was most intense, and where the combination of price, financing, and value change is most impactful in absolute dollar terms. The aspirational move-up buyer, the pilot who'd been flying a basic trainer for years and decided in 2022 that this was finally the moment to step up into something with a full glass panel, real autopilot capability, and the kind of performance that makes cross-country flying genuinely enjoyable rather than an exercise in patience. This buyer represents a huge portion of the 2022 sales numbers. These are six-figure to low seven-figure transactions, not trivial numbers, and the people who made these purchases are not casual buyers. They're successful, educated people who run real numbers before making major financial decisions. And yet the combination of factors we've been discussing caught enough of them in a position they didn't fully anticipate that the for-sale listings tell a pretty clear story. What makes the high-end single market particularly interesting right now is the three-way competition that's developed between new aircraft sitting on dealer ramps, 2022-era used aircraft coming back to market, and older, thoroughly proven airframes that the market has discovered are actually quite good at satisfying the primary mission for a lot of buyers at a fraction of the cost. A pilot who wants to fly cross-country in comfort with a capable autopilot and solid weather avoidance has more options than ever right now, and the options at the lower end of the price spectrum have gotten meaningfully better as avionics technology has matured and retrofit options have expanded. The buyer who might have felt in 2022 that they needed a new airplane to get the panel they wanted can now get very close to the same capability in a well-maintained older airframe with a modern avionics suite for maybe 40% of what a new equivalent would cost. That math is pulling buyers toward older iron in a way that puts additional downward pressure on the used values of 2022 purchases. The turboprop segment has its own version of this story with its own specific dynamics, and because the numbers involved are larger, the financial consequences for sellers in this category are proportionally more significant. The turboprop buyer who purchased in 2022 was typically a step further up the aviation pyramid, often a very successful business owner or professional who was using the aircraft for genuine business transportation and had justifiable reasons on a cost-benefit basis for owning rather than relying on commercial or charter. These buyers paid north of $3 million in many cases for new turboprops in that period, sometimes significantly north of that for fully loaded configurations. They financed them when rates had already started moving, but before the full magnitude of the rate environment was clear. And they're now trying to exit into a used turboprop market that has more inventory, a more cautious buyer, and a clear comparison to gently used examples from a few years prior that offer essentially the same transportation capability at a meaningful discount. The turboprop seller in this market has a more sophisticated buyer across the table than the piston single market, which in some ways makes it harder. A buyer considering a used turboprop in the $1.5 to $2.5 million range is not buying on emotion. They're doing a genuine financial and operational analysis. They're probably working with an aviation attorney, a CPA who handles aircraft transactions, a pre-purchase inspection team, and they know the market. They know what comparable aircraft have actually transacted at, not just what they're listed at. They know what the seller's likely cost basis was, and they will negotiate accordingly. Sellers in this category who are emotionally attached to recovering their purchase price are having a very difficult time finding buyers, and sellers who are willing to be realistic about where the market is are selling but accepting losses that are hard to look at in the transaction statement. The light twin market, which was never enormous to begin with, has its own distinct version of this story, driven heavily by the demographic and insurance factors I mentioned earlier. Light twins attract a buyer profile that skews older and wealthier, and that buyer profile is running straight into the combination of aging-related medical certificate challenges and insurance underwriter caution about older pilots in higher-performance multi-engine aircraft. A 2022 buyer in this category who is now confronting either a medical issue or an insurance renewal conversation that has gone somewhere unexpected is in a very difficult position. They own an airplane that's harder to insure than it was when they bought it, harder to sell in the current market, and declining in value while it sits. The cost per hour of keeping a light twin operational at low flight hours is significant enough that parking it and waiting for a better market is not free, and some of these owners are making the calculation that accepting a loss now is better than accumulating carrying costs while hoping conditions improve. I want to spend some time on the training aircraft market because it tells a slightly different version of this story, one that's less about individual owner buyers and more about flight school operators, but with financial consequences that are in some ways even more dramatic at the institutional level. Flight schools ramped up aircraft purchases aggressively in 2021 and 2022 in response to the surge in student demand. New student enrollments were at levels the industry hadn't seen in decades. Airlines were desperately hiring, the regional pilot pipeline was roaring, and every flight school in the country was trying to expand capacity to capture what looked like a durable, long-term demand expansion. They bought training aircraft, primarily simple two-seat trainers and four-seat trainers, at elevated prices, and they financed those purchases at whatever rates were available at the time of acquisition, which, for schools that acted in mid-2022 or later, meant rates that were already significantly elevated. The demand picture for flight training has moderated from those 2021-2022 peak levels. Not collapsed, not fallen off a cliff, but moderated meaningfully. The airline hiring frenzy has settled into something more sustainable and less desperate. Some of the regional carriers that were offering unprecedented incentives to attract pilots have adjusted their signing bonuses and training sponsorships as the most acute shortage phase passed. And the students who came into training purely chasing the rapid airline hiring news cycle, rather than out of a genuine love for flying, have had a higher than normal attrition rate, the same pattern we see with the pandemic-motivated individual buyer cohort. Flight schools sitting on expanded fleets purchased at 2022 pricing with 2022 financing, now trying to put those airplanes to work against a student demand base that's grown but hasn't grown as fast as the fleet expansion assumed it would, are in a genuinely difficult position financially. The airplanes need annuals regardless of how many hours they fly. They need to be insured regardless of student enrollment. Hangar and tie-down costs accrue monthly. And for schools that stretched into debt to fund the expansion, the loan payments don't take a break, because the demand projection was too optimistic. Some of those training aircraft are now quietly for sale, and when a flight school with 6 or 8 or 10 aircraft it needs to move puts them on the market at the same time, individual owner pilots are listing their 2022 purchases. The supply of a particular type can increase quite suddenly in a way that moves the market noticeably. That's happening right now in certain training aircraft categories, and it's part of why specific models that were genuinely hard to find at any price 2.5 years ago are now available with enough selection that a buyer actually has negotiating leverage for the first time in recent memory. There's a geographic dimension to this that's worth understanding if you're actively shopping or selling, because the market doesn't behave uniformly across the country. In the major coastal markets where there's a high concentration of high-income buyers, demand for quality used aircraft has held up better than in mid-continent markets where the economic pressures have hit harder and where there's historically been less of a deep buyer pool for higher-end general aviation. A 2-year-old, well-equipped piston single, listed in Southern California or the Northeast, is going to find a buyer faster and at a better price than the same airplane listed in a market with thinner buyer depth. Sellers who understand this are willing to take their listing national and deal with the complexity of a long-distance transaction because the buyer pool in their local market simply may not offer the depth they need to get a fair result. Dealers are navigating this from a position that is genuinely difficult in ways that aren't always obvious from the outside. A dealer who took delivery of aircraft on behalf of order-cancel buyers, or who bought spec inventory to have product available, is now sitting on asset carrying costs that compound monthly, and their ability to hold firm on price is directly constrained by how long they can absorb those carrying costs before the financial pressure forces a deal that's below where they'd prefer to be. The dealers who are most exposed are the ones who bought aggressively and broadly during the demand peak, betting that the market conditions would persist long enough for them to move the inventory at full margin. Some of them bet right and turned their inventory quickly. Some of them are now working through a balance sheet situation that requires moving airplanes at margins that don't make the prior inventory decisions look smart in retrospect. What does all of this mean for the person sitting at home right now trying to decide what to do with their own situation? Let me break it down by the most common situations people are actually in. If you bought in 2022 and you're thinking about selling, the most important thing you can do right now is get an honest valuation, not from the dealer who sold you the airplane, not from the highest appraisal you can find, but from the actual market data on what comparable aircraft have actually closed at in the last 60 to 90 days. That's a different number than what similar aircraft are listed at. Listed prices in a softening market consistently run ahead of transaction prices because sellers are slow to accept where the market actually is, and buyers are sophisticated enough to know the difference. If you need to sell, pricing to the market will get you a transaction. Pricing to where you need to be financially will get you months of carrying costs while the airplane sits, and the market potentially drifts further in the wrong direction. If you're holding an aircraft, you don't really need to sell, but that has become genuinely burdensome financially. There's a conversation worth having about whether there's a middle path that reduces your cost of ownership while you wait for conditions to potentially improve. Live-aboard arrangements at some airports, partnerships, shared ownership arrangements, or simply flying the airplane more to justify the fixed costs it's generating are all worth thinking through before committing to a sale that locks in a loss that might look different in 2 or 3 years. The caveat on the wait-and-see approach is that it requires genuine financial discipline, meaning you have to be honest about whether you can actually carry the costs of waiting without it becoming an increasing drain on your broader financial health. If you're a buyer looking at this market, I want to talk to you specifically, because this environment, uncomfortable as it is for sellers, is meaningfully better for buyers than anything we've seen in the last several years, and that opportunity deserves to be named clearly. The combination of motivated sellers, increased used inventory, new aircraft inventory sitting on dealer ramps, and a generally less frenzied market means that a buyer who is patient, well-prepared, and willing to negotiate is in the best position to buy a quality airplane at a fair price that we've seen since before the pandemic boom. Not a distressed price, not a below-market steal, but a fair market price on a well-maintained aircraft from a seller who is actually motivated to complete a transaction, which is a very different experience from the 2021-2022 market where sellers could take offers or leave them, and buyers were lucky to get a return phone call. The way to take advantage of this without making mistakes is to do the process correctly, which means more discipline, not less, even though the buyer has leverage. Pre-purchase inspections are not negotiable. In any market, but especially in a market where some sellers are listing aircraft they've been deferring maintenance on because they knew they were going to sell, a thorough pre-purchase inspection by a shop with no relationship to the seller is the single most important step in protecting yourself from a problem that doesn't show up until after you've signed the papers and wired the money. Budget for it, plan for it, and never let a seller's desire to close quickly pressure you into skipping it. The financing conversation needs to happen before you fall in love with a specific airplane, not after. Current rates are what they are, and the monthly payment on a given purchase price at current rates is a real number you need to be comfortable with before you commit, not something to reconcile with afterward. Get a pre-approval or at minimum a real rate quote from an aircraft-specific lender before you start writing offers, and be honest with yourself about where the payment lands relative to your overall financial picture, including the other costs of ownership that the financing payment is just one piece of. Insurance deserves the same advance attention, particularly if you're stepping up in performance, complexity, or category from what you've flown before. Call a broker before you're in escrow on a specific airplane. Describe what you want to buy, describe your logbook accurately and honestly, and ask for a realistic premium range and any conditions that will be attached to coverage. There is nothing worse in a used aircraft purchase than getting into contract on an airplane you love, having a pre-purchase inspection come back clean, and then discovering during the insurance underwriting process that coverage for your specific combination of pilot experience and aircraft type is either unavailable from reasonable carriers or priced at a level that makes the whole transaction make no financial sense. That happens. It happens more than people talk about, and the way to prevent it from happening to you is to surface the insurance reality at the beginning of the process rather than at the end. The category selection decision is where a lot of buyers make errors that they don't fully recognize as errors until they've owned the airplane for a year or two. The temptation, especially in a buyer's market where you can get more airplane for your money than you could 2 years ago, is to buy up into capability that exceeds your actual mission requirements. A faster, more capable airplane with more avionics is always appealing on paper, and when prices are down and sellers are motivated, it's easy to talk yourself into something you technically can afford, but that doesn't actually serve your flying better than a simpler, less expensive option would. Be honest about what you actually fly, where you actually go, how often you actually fly it, and what problems you actually need the airplane to solve. An airplane that's right-sized for your mission and your experience level is a much better financial and practical decision than an airplane that's right-sized for the pilot you aspire to be someday. There's an irony in the current market that's worth naming explicitly, which is that some of the best value right now is in the airplanes that the 2022 buyers were stepping up from. While the popular new models and the hot used categories have seen the most volatility, some of the older, simpler, thoroughly proven training-adjacent aircraft, the 172s, the Cherokees, the Moonies, the older Bonanzas, have held their value more stably precisely because they never participated as fully in the speculative demand surge. They were always priced against what buyers could realistically afford to pay for them given their mission utility, and that pricing stability makes them a genuinely interesting value in a market where a lot of other categories are in price discovery mode. Let me say something about the psychological side of this that I think deserves to be acknowledged, because this is a community where people talk about airplanes in ways that make financial discussion feel almost inappropriate. Airplanes mean something to the people who fly them that goes well beyond the asset balance sheet, and there's a version of this story that gets told entirely in terms of numbers and loses something real in the process. The pilots who bought in 2022 and are now selling weren't stupid people who made obvious mistakes. They were people who love flying, who worked hard to get to a point in their lives where they could own a serious airplane, and who made their decision in the context of a market and an emotional moment that conspired to produce an outcome they wouldn't have chosen with perfect information. Some of them are selling now, with genuine grief about it, not just the financial loss, but the sense that the dream had a different ending than they planned. That's a real thing, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we reduce the entire situation to depreciation percentages and interest rate spreads. The flip side of that, and the reason it's worth talking about honestly rather than just sympathetically, is that the people who make decisions in general aviation with more financial discipline, who buy right-sized aircraft for their actual mission and financial picture, who don't stretch to capture the peak of a market cycle, who do the insurance and financing math before they fall in love with a specific tail number, those people are generally still flying. Their airplanes are still worth something real. They're still getting utility from what they own. And in a market where their peers are selling at a loss, they're quietly presented with opportunities to trade up, buy an additional aircraft, or simply benefit from lower prices when they eventually decide to exit. The financial discipline isn't just about avoiding the downside, it's what allows you to actually enjoy the upside when the market gives it to you. There are some structural things happening right now that are going to shape this market going forward, and that are worth understanding before we close out this conversation. Because the 2022 buying wave and its aftermath isn't just a historical story, it's actively shaping what the market looks like in 2024, 2025, and beyond. The used inventory increase from 2022-era sellers is not a brief blip. These airplanes are 2-3 years old now, and they're coming to market with histories that include whatever happened in those first 2 to 3 years of ownership, which in some cases includes maintenance deferrals, accident history that may not be fully disclosed up front, and condition that reflects how the owner was using the aircraft, which for some of the buyers who are now eager to exit wasn't flying it hard enough to keep it in peak condition. Every airplane has its own story, and buyers need to do the work to understand the specific history of the specific aircraft they're considering, not assume that a recent vintage means a clean history. The insurance market, which has been one of the dominant forces in this whole story, shows no near-term signs of softening materially. Underwriters are responding to actuarial reality, and the factors that have made aviation insurance tighter, the repair cost increases, the parts availability challenges, the accident pattern data around certain pilot profiles and aircraft types, those factors are not resolving themselves quickly. Buyers who are counting on insurance getting dramatically easier or cheaper over the next year or two as part of their ownership plan are making an assumption that the insurance market data doesn't support. Plan for the insurance environment we actually have, not the one that existed in 2019. Maintenance costs and parts availability are going to remain a real factor in aircraft value assessment for the foreseeable future, and this is particularly true for aircraft models where the support ecosystem has thinned out. A brand on your airplane that has fewer service centers than it used to have, or that has experienced supply chain challenges with certain components, is going to be worth less in the market than an equivalent aircraft on a platform with a deep, healthy support network, regardless of what the hours and condition look like. This is especially relevant for anyone considering some of the newer or smaller manufacturers who entered the market during the boom years on the strength of enthusiasm and investor capital, rather than the kind of deep manufacturing and support infrastructure that you need to be a reliable long-term player in certified aircraft production. The regulatory picture continues to evolve, and while the sport pilot expansion we've touched on is the most visible recent change, there are ongoing conversations happening in the FAA certification world around things like the General Aviation Airworthiness Assurance Framework and how maintenance regulations affect owner maintenance on various aircraft categories. These conversations matter financially because they affect the cost of keeping an aircraft legal and airworthy, which affects both operating costs and resale values, and they're worth paying attention to even for people who aren't usually deep into the regulatory weeds. The electrification story is going to be part of the background of this market for years, without being the dominant story in the near term for most of the buyers and sellers we've been discussing. What it does create is a kind of low-grade uncertainty about long-term values for conventional piston aircraft, particularly in training applications where the operational economics of electric alternatives are potentially quite compelling if the infrastructure and certification challenges get resolved. That uncertainty is already showing up subtly in how some buyers are thinking about long-term hold scenarios for conventional piston trainers, and it's worth accounting for in any purchase decision where you're planning to hold for 5 or more years and where the aircraft's utility is heavily dependent on the training market. I'll close with something that I think is genuinely useful for anyone trying to make sense of this market from the outside, which is a way of thinking about what the 2022 buying wave and its aftermath actually tells us about general aviation as an asset class versus general aviation as a way of life.